Hey guys, it's Mike here and welcome back to Laughingstock Cinema. In this video, I'm going to be discussing one of my absolute favorite comic book movies of all time, and one I consider to be required viewing, not just for Marvel fans, comic book fans, but also action film fans in general. And that would have to be 2004's Punisher, starring Thomas Jane, which in my opinion is an absolute underrated classic and something that a lot more people need to see, especially those who are fans of the previous iteration of superhero films that came out before the modern era of the MCU basically dominating the box office. So, with that being said, for me, this is a movie that has always been one of my favorites ever since I originally saw it in theaters back when I was 14 years old, in fact. And nowadays, it's something that I've continued to go back to time after time after time and still holds up even almost 20 years later, which really goes to show you just how good of a movie it really is. So, when it comes to The Punisher 2004, of course, everything anchors around the Punisher himself, played by Thomas Jane. Now, this is not exactly the typical iteration of the Punisher character. There definitely are some differences, which is something that I've heard over the years that some people didn't particularly like about that adaptation of the character. It doesn't necessarily take place in New York like a lot of the other versions do. Instead, the Punisher takes place down in Florida, more particularly in the Miami area. Furthermore, not just that, but we also get a slightly different variation of Punisher's origins, which makes everything in the film a lot more personal for Thomas Jane's variation iteration of the character, and a lot of other elements that go in its own particular path. However, despite all of that, despite the adaptational differences, I think that this film does an excellent job of capturing the spirit of this character, who has always been one of my absolute favorites when it comes to comic book characters, because whereas the Punisher nowadays kind of has a stigma about him because of the politicization of, comic books and particularly this character, the thing is that the Punisher is someone who is never really a villain nor a hero. He is many times described as an anti-hero or even an anti-villain. But for me, Punisher is a character who really goes above and beyond what most of the other characters did, at least up until this modern variation where they kill indiscriminately, whether they be Batman, Superman, Captain America, and the list goes on, and was a character who would get the job done in a finite way. He would make sure to take villains off the street and put them 6 feet deep in the ground if that's exactly what happened when he crossed their paths. He was somebody who was not afraid to kill his enemies, to punish them, in effect, to try and take the most evil people, give them a dose of their own medicine, and to eliminate them once and for all. Which, in many ways, when you're a fan of characters like I am, my favorite character when it comes to comic books is Batman. Daredevil's another one that's great, and I'll get a little bit into that when it comes to the other adaptations of The Punisher soon. That is something that is kind of refreshing because for a very long time, with regard to characters, particularly with superheroes or comic book vigilantes, these characters refused to kill. They had the no-kill code. So when The Punisher came along back in the 60s and 70s, as a Vietnam veteran getting back on the streets, having his own tragedy that occurred with his family being killed in the original comics kind of indiscriminately just by a random gang violence event, and then all the subsequent adaptations, in a more personal way that tied directly into the story. The Punisher was set loose after taking a bullet to his brain in some variations, kind of symbolizing that skull, or, of course, in the heart in this particular version. And going about putting an end to everyone in his path. And when we get into this movie itself, one of the ways that they do a great job of that is the action. So let me pull up the IMDb. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So, with regard to this film was directed by Jonathan Hensley, and he hasn't really done a lot of high-profile movies over the years. He did some things here and there. I think his most recent films are the Ice Trucker movie starring Liam Neeson. However, he does an excellent job with this film of creating not only a fun action thrill ride, but doing all of the action sequences practically. One thing I have to say about the incredible nature of this movie that makes it stand out, especially in this day and age, is the fact that all of the action sequences that we get throughout it are practically done, and that's all on a practically low budget. You see what I did there? Which is about, I believe, $30 million. I can go right down here and it could even tell me, fortunately, I got the IMDb pulled up right here and now. And the fact of the matter is that when you think about that, everything really goes to show you exactly how talented everyone here was on display, because even though maybe there are some action sequences here and there where you could see some dummies or some kind of makeup being used by the stunt people, nonetheless, all the explosions, which there are plenty of in this film, the car crashes, the squibs, everything is practically done in camera, with the exception, I believe, of all the skull explosions that you see later on at the end of the movie, which is kind of a signature of these early 2000s comic book movies. Furthermore, in terms of the performances from the cast, let's get into that right now. Thomas Jane, of course, played Frank Castle, and honestly, for me, he does perhaps my absolute favorite live action version of the Punisher thus far. He has a great, really multi layered variation of this character, Frank Castle, where you believe everything that he says throughout the course of the movie. You totally align with him, even when sometimes some of the fight scenes or even the lines that he's saying are a little bit over the top, and you know exactly why he's doing what he's doing. His motivations are extremely clear from the very start, and as a result, when everything gets underway, you definitely sympathize with him, and he's able to bring the gravitas to this role, as well as a number of other roles that Thomas Jane does over the years, because he is really one of the best and most underrated actors of his generation, in my opinion, and he brings all of that skill to this role, really embodying it in a way that, gives everyone else to embody it afterward a run for their money. I'll be getting into some of those other variations afterward. The main villain of the movie was John Travolta's Howard Saint. This isn't exactly Jigsaw or one of these other big main iconic villains from the Punisher story. However, John Travolta does a really good job of being this kind of sleazy mobster character with his family, who is ultimately doing everything he can to get revenge upon Frank Castle for the death of his son, which his wife, played by Laura Harding, goes directly into as well. She, in some ways, is actually even more evil than Howard Saint, because the fact that she's the one who really orders the whole hit in the first place and makes the exception, or really the inclusion, of every single character or every single member of Thomas Jane's family being included in that particular fight and execution. But Howard Saint, I think, does a really good job of kind of pitting that kind of drug lord type character, who's directly in line, in effect, with the Cuban mob in the cartels. And, we see that Thomas Jane does everything he can to destroy Howard Saint's life throughout the course of the film, truly punishing him in the sense that the Punisher does, by destroying his family, his business, his reputation, before eventually bringing everything to a close in that same sense. We also have Jimmy Weeks, played by A. Russell Andrews, who is one of Frank Castle's closest friends, but for anyone who's a fan of the comic or who's seen this movie before, you know exactly what turns out in that case, and it is kind of a ironic twist, as well as the ending that we only truly get to see in the, if I remember correctly, extended version of the film, which is the superior cut in my estimation. Furthermore, we also get characters making up the friends, or really the kind of associates that Frank Castle makes throughout the film, where he goes to this apartment complex in Florida where a lot of the film takes place. It kind of takes a different direction than you would think, where we meet Ben Foster's character, we meet John Panay, who is one of my absolute favorite comic book, or my favorite stand-up comics of all time. The late John Panay, who does a great job as playing another one, the associates and friends. We also have Rebecca Romaine Stamos, I believe, at the time, who also plays a character who, in some ways, seemed like she was being set up as kind of a love interest for Thomas Jane's character, but fortunately, throughout the course of the film, they don't necessarily go in that direction because a lot of it is demonstrating just how much of a single minded focus that the Punisher, that Frank Castle, has when it comes to getting revenge on the people who destroyed his family and his life in that first place. So I think that everyone does a great job here with the material that they're given, with this low budget. They're able to elevate everything. Of course, there's the great fight scene and the shootout and the chase scene between Harry Heck, played by Mark Colley, as well as Thomas Jane's Frank Castle. There's the awesome scene where Frank Castle has the shootout in the lobby of the Saint building, where then he proceeds to dump all the money into the street. Well, it actually comes before, so he could set up the whole thing. There's a lot of things that are really well thought out ahead of time, which lead into the film itself ending up having that kind of excellent, setup and payoff that we see all throughout. And he uses a lot of different weaponry throughout the course of the film. He doesn't just use guns; he also uses explosions. He uses a crossbow, and there's a lot of really in-depth, gory sequences that you see throughout the course of the film. Like I said, the setup between Rebecca Romijn's character, and Rebecca Romijn, of course, played Mystique in the X-Men movies, whereas Ben Foster, as I talked about before, also played Angel. So you had that previous chemistry that they also added into here. Furthermore, you have one of the most fun action fight sequences taking place between Thomas Jane's Frank Castle and Kevin Nash, Diesel, one of the most iconic wrestlers of the 1990s and early 2000s, fighting where Kevin Nash is playing the Russian. And there's actually a scene during this that goes to show just how not only awesome the action is in this movie, but additionally how badass Kevin Nash is, because he actually gets stabbed by Frank Castle in this movie, and the knife goes through his prosthetic and stabs him for real. And he's so caught up in the action sequence that he goes and proceeds to continue to fight and slamming him throughout the course of the plays. There's a lot of humor in that fight scene and a lot of the other ones as well. Whereas the other characters are actually in the other room, they're listening to some iconic classic music, and everything is happening where Frank Castle actually has a grenade thrown at him when he's in the bathtub. There's the explosion. He gets hit in the head with the toilet. I mean, there's so many awesome sequences throughout the course of the film, and there's so many different unique ways that he gets kills. Like, for example, with this paper cutter he hits somebody right in the face with. They definitely don't shy away from the actions and the gore in this movie either, nor do we get any kind of holding back when it comes to things like this between John Travolta and his kind of comeuppance that we see throughout the course of the film as it goes along. So overall, I think that they did a really excellent job with pretty much every different aspect of this film, top to bottom. It definitely is one of the most underrated comic book movies pre-Marvel in the MCU, and is one of those films that, despite the budget being 1/10 of a lot of these big budget films, puts most of them to shame, especially nowadays, where so many of the films are either overly politicized or they are just, so on the nose in terms of their theming, in terms of their different types of storytelling, whereas this one, straight, simple, to the point, and we only really got one of them. Unless, of course, you do want to count the Punisher Dirty Laundry, the short film that Thomas Jane did, which you could actually see as an 8.0 on IMDb, which is significantly higher than the 6.4 that we see on here, which honestly for me should at least be an 8 as well, because of the fact that there's so many MCU movies or DCU movies or, other movies that are action-based that have come out since, that this movie really puts to shame. But when you think about it, Dirty Laundry shows that Thomas Jane, even years later, 8 years after the original Punisher, is still excellent in this role. And 11 years, as of this recording later, I would love to see him return to the role because he did an amazing job. Just to get a sequel to this movie, just to get a one-off. You could bring back all the cast if you want to, or just put him in a new environment, maybe put him in New York City like the original iconic Punisher, and we'll see where it goes from there. Now, in terms of the other adaptations, we do have Punisher Warzone, for example, which of course had the late actor Ray Stevenson playing the role of the Punisher. that's a movie I'll talk more about in the future. Actually have not yet seen this one, however, I have heard different things about it. Nonetheless, it's definitely something that has never really had a good reception for the most part, aside from Ray Stevenson's performance in the role, which I've seen little clips of here and there, but I would like to actually watch in depth before I do an in depth review. Of course, there also is the original Dolph Lundgren, The Punisher, from 1989, which, it definitely is a movie of its time. Dolph Lundgren, well, he's definitely not Drago in this movie or anything, but nonetheless, it isn't necessarily a movie I think is quite as good as the Thomas Jane Punisher. But there is another Punisher that has come out in the past so many years, which is played by John Bernthal, who also played Shane in The Walking Dead, and I think he did an excellent job debuting the character in the Daredevil series. However, when it comes to the show itself, The Punisher, in many ways, I don't really think that the show necessarily lived up to the original Thomas Jane movie, or at least the remake of the original movie, which came out in 1989. And with that being said, I do think that John Bernthal, though, still does an amazing job in the role. He really stands apart in terms of most of the Punisher actors and many of the most current up-to-date variations of the comics in the movies and Netflix and so on and so forth. He does a great job, just like Charlie Cox does a great job with both them embodying their characters. However, overall, I still have to give the edge to Thomas Jane, even if in some ways you could argue that perhaps John Bernthal is a little bit more close to the comic book version of the character. But even then, there are a number of different changes in the story to Punisher's backstory in the TV show on Netflix. And with that being said, I don't feel like the Punisher TV show ever truly got as high as the heights of Daredevil Season 2 when we're getting that fight between Daredevil and the Punisher, the battle of ideals of the no-kill code for Daredevil and the kill code for the Punisher, and so many of those amazing 10 out of 10 episodes that we got from the first half of Season 2. So overall, when it comes down to it, I would say that The Punisher 2004 is an underrated classic, one of the best comic book movies, in my opinion, of all time, one of my absolute favorite movies of all time that I've gone back and rewatched time and time and time again, and it still holds up almost 20 years later, which goes to show you that's still great and it could hold its own against many of the best comic book movies that have come out in the past 10 or 15 years. But with that being said, guys, this has been my breakdown analysis of why I believe that The Punisher 2004 is an underrated classic. I think that if you guys haven't seen it, you should definitely check it out. I think it's on streaming right now. You could buy the Blu-ray. Not sure if it came out in 4K yet, but if it does, I'm going to buy that day one if I already, didn't miss it, I guess. But with that being said, I'd love for, if this for some reason somebody watches this from the studios, make another movie, Disney or whoever would be able to do that with Thomas Jane, bring him in the multiverse. I don't really care. In fact, the matter is, I'd love to see more from him as the Punisher in the future. Even though it's been decades, I'm sure he'd be game to do it because he's done things like Dirty Laundry in the past. He's still great. He's still capable of doing that performance. And, maybe we could have some multiversal crossover with him and John Bernthal fighting against one another, or some teaming up to punish all of the different villains in the MCU. You could even do a what if scenario where Punisher kills the MCU, kind of like they did in the comics. That'd be pretty fun to see too. But if you guys are new here, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications so you can stay up to date with all my future videos. Make sure to leave a like, share your own thoughts down below because I'd love to hear them, especially when it comes to this movie, and maybe some other movies you'd like to hear me talk about in the future. I'm going to be reviewing a lot of my absolute favorites on here moving forward. And, of course, remember, if you wish for peace, you must first prepare for war. Make sure to stick around because there's a lot more to come in the future.